you have.
Let's get started.
Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for coming along. These are the interim findings. The survey in relation to this engagement activity is still open until the 1st of August. So the final findings that you see reflected in reports to Council Committee and to the Edinburgh Partnership may be slightly different than this. And obviously the reason for doing this presentation is to give people an opportunity to ask questions and maybe correct some of my understanding about some of this stuff as well. Start off with, I'll run you through some of the key messages that I think have come out of this for Edinburgh Partners. In some cases, we may go into more detail about these as we go through the findings. In some cases, it may simply be the case that I just say, here are the key issues, and we don't need to discuss them any further because I think they're fairly self-explanatory. So to start off with, we have the issue of how larger organizations like the council, for example, can provide a reduction in risk to smaller organizations. We think that there are lots of benefits to basically be able to provide longer term guarantees of funding for smaller organizations, which are completely disproportionate to the risk that we would face from doing that. And larger organizations generally enter into longer term contracts anyway as a routine matter. We think this is an easy win for us, and that reflects a lot of the feedback that we've had from the sector as part of this. We have a real problem of the proportionality of application monitoring, reporting mechanisms, but as well as proportionality, there is the issue that these all seem to be black boxes. Routinely, what the sector has reflected back to me in these conversations is that they receive little, if any, feedback through them, whether that's good or bad in many cases. And therefore, these mechanisms simply aren't influencing behavior one way or the other. We think that what funders should be doing much more is building meaningful relationships with funded organizations and using those relationships to build shared belief and shared ownership of outcomes more than simply a paperwork compliance exercise wherever that's possible. We think that there's a lot of behaviors by funders in the public sector in particular, which have led to third sector organizations not feeling respected, not feeling trusted, feeling generally undervalued. And what has been my experience of a lot of the conversations we've been having is that all of those three things are really important for ensuring that the third sector is able to contribute properly to the sort of shared values and the shared outcomes of the entire city. So involving the third sector more in strategic level decisions, looking at how full cost recovery is done, where we're specifically asking you to do things. All of these things are really important in terms of how we are showing trust, how we are showing respect to the sector. Generally, what we're seeing actually is some as the sector is acknowledging that things are becoming much more difficult and much more competitive in relation to funding, we are seeing that competition is undermining trust within the third sector itself. There's things I think that funders can do, but I think one of the important things we have to recognize is that trust does not exist automatically between third sector organizations, and there are meaningful things that we should be doing in order to build trust within the sector, and particularly where we are asking for collaboration in funding opportunities as well. We think there is an attitude within the sector that has that feels like funding opportunities go to those who are in the know. Or who have, in some cases, disturbing cases, connections, personal connections to funders. There's obviously a problem with those attitudes just existing in itself. Now, obviously, I can't verify that those things happen, but certainly recognizing that the third sector believes they happen means that there's a problem there, and there's really more that we need to be doing in order to communicate funding opportunities and for the processes around decision making to be more open with the people who are looking for funding through them. Access to facilities, big thing, from relatively simple things and administrative things like just being able to access a meeting space to talk to other staff members is something that partners struggle to provide access to. And for service delivery, we have adopted, I think, probably a very risk intolerant attitude to doing that, which is an obstacle for delivery. I think there's an opportunity for all partners to do more in relation to that. It seems like the third sector has a lot of opportunity within it to quote collaborate on shared training. I can't provide a specific instruction for who would be best to lead on that or who would be best to organize it. I think it is something for the Edinburgh Partnership and the third sector interface to consider on this, because it seems at the moment that lots of individual organizations are organizing training on an individual basis, which could probably be organized collaboratively a little bit better. ICT is a concern. My feedback, the feedback that I've received from the third sector is that generally everyone's working on a second-hand laptop, don't really understand long-term security issues, and in some cases are dealing with fairly immediate obsolescence problems in terms of bits of software that they're using. A little bit of coordination, I think, from partners could be very useful in that area. And there's an interesting point in terms of community benefit. There's a lot of feeling that community benefit in public sector procurement contracts really doesn't result in any actual change and no real benefit to communities. There are a couple of really interesting examples of what has been done. The Edinburgh and South East Scotland city deal essentially has their own portal. The NHS has its own portal. I think we should explore opportunities for third sector organisations to basically post requests for what they would like, and for Edinburgh partners to direct more of their community benefit clauses towards those things which make sense to third sector organisations who are actually working in communities, rather than having these generally private sector organisations imagine a third sector benefit or a community benefit, sorry. Just to summarize, this engagement in general was about understanding the needs of the third sector and what Edinburgh partners could do to support them a little bit better, and also to see what the third sector could do potentially to support itself a little bit better. We invited a number of organizations to take part in open and frank conversations. These were held in third sector organization buildings generally. We also went along to network events, and we had a survey as well, and a handful of individual conversations took place in relation to this as well, supported by a literature review. And alongside these processes, ourselves, the council, and a number of other Edinburgh partners have been looking at our internal funding processes and looking at how we might streamline those a bit more. But this section doesn't touch really on the literature review or those internal reviews. It's really just reflecting back messages from the engagement element. These figures obviously draft. I know that the online survey, for example, has had slightly more than 60 responses as of this point. These findings are all based on that number, however, and as I said at the beginning, that survey is open until the beginning of August, August 1st. So we estimate that somewhere between 100 and 150 individual organizations were involved, but there's some overlap between people who attended at workshops, people who filled in the forms, people who attended at networks, that sort of thing. So the number of participations for this work is around 215, basically. And all of those workshops were attended by and run by council officers. Most of them were run by me in person. Quick note on the use of the term the third sector. I know that, and certainly several people spoke to me through this exercise saying that they were not particularly happy with using the term the third sector. I think the issue with this for me is that there isn't an accepted alternative term across the sector, and a number of suggestions were certainly made in relation to this. I want to be clear that I'm not using this in a way that in any way does not recognize the importance of the contribution that is made by volunteers, charities, and social enterprises, and don't think of their contributions as being secondary or tertiary to the work of the private or the public sectors in relation to this. So happy to use another term, but not really seeing any consensus on what that other term should be. Uh, we did not, through this exercise, try to make organizations evidence that they were doing good things. We simply began this process by saying we believe the third sector makes a valuable contribution. However, through conversations, we did identify a number of factors which define for us what the third sector identifies as being that stronger approach in some areas, that contribution that third sector organizations make, particularly. Agility, being able to organize around problems quickly. In some cases, this is because organizations are smaller, in some cases, because they are closer to problems and communities in some way. Trust, that big issue in terms of working with people. Obviously, when you're talking about the council being involved, the council has a number of fairly scary powers that it can apply to people and is often a debtor in many cases, sorry, a creditor in many cases to residents, and third sector organizations can find it much easier to work with people when they don't have those powers and they don't have that financial relationship. A lot of third sector organizations talked about their different shape of relationship with people, talking about a whole person or a whole family approach, and recognizing that this is often different than what the council does, and in which a lot of public sector bodies do, where we are focused in silos and we do one thing and often have difficulty speaking to others. That's not the approach that third sector organizations tend to take and certainly try to take. And cost. And in part, this is because of lower overheads for the third sector. Generally speaking, the same kind of support costs less to provide for the third sector than it does for public sector organizations to do that. Those are the main benefits. Recognizing some general pressures on the third sector, and worth pointing out that whilst these all came through from the sessions, these are also backed up by the literature review as being things which are common in the third sector nationally, not just in Edinburgh. So recognizing that funding is becoming much more difficult to secure. Shorter term, less secure, but also reduced from all sources in particular, and that is leading to an increase in competition for that funding, which obviously means that the chief executive officers of third sector organizations and other support officers are spending more time, and that process requires more expertise to get even the same result that they got before, and in many cases, a lesser result is what is being generated by that activity. Against that, obviously, third sector organizations are not immune to inflation. Seeing the impacts of those and the impact of the national insurance increases has made that difficulty in increasing funding all the more acute, and recognizing that third sector organizations obviously are generally receiving fixed funding at the start of contracts or grants, which don't have uplifts built into them. There are some premises problems, very variable. It seems some people are fine, some people are having higher costs, some people are recognizing it difficult to locate any premises at all. And then reporting that volunteering levels are down, and also the expectation levels of volunteers are different. And this has changed over a number of years. And in particular, people are reporting back that younger people's expectations of what volunteering opportunities contribute may be much higher than older generations have been. So those kind of general pressures. We also asked organizations to talk about the specific pressures for their organization. So we asked people to pick their top three priorities or their top three problems, I suppose we might say. What you can see there is very clearly that what we're talking about are funding problems. Those top four things are really all in one way or another being driven by difficulties in getting funding or difficulties in the reliability of that funding, followed on by volunteer shortages, and then much less significant issues going on after that. So one of the things that we want to stress to the Edinburgh Partnership is that whilst this activity was not about how we necessarily increase an amount of funding for the sector, it is going to be an area where the sector is recognizing a great deal of difficulty. And as was covered in the previous slides, some people who've been working in this area for 20 or 30 years are reflecting that these are the most pressured circumstances that they've ever encountered in that time. We asked you about SCVO fair funding as part of this, and enormously supportive across the board. I think it would be fair to say. Those are my summaries of what fair funding means. But as part of the survey, participants were overwhelmingly supportive of that. Some interesting points arose from group discussions around this. There were concerns that if you tied up funding for longer term, that meant you would end up with a situation where organizations, in particular, perhaps smaller organizations, were blocked out and could not access funding for several years. So that, I think, is something that we need to bear in mind when we are thinking about what we can do in relation to this. Also recognizing that there is a difference between applying for grants, applying for contracts, and actually delivering service, and that those are not necessarily the same skills. But what the third sector, when talking about this, was keen to articulate was that everyone wants public money to be well accounted for and well spent through this. Um, Brings us to what I call the bleed build cycle. Essentially, which is how I encapsulate the 1 year funding problem that organizations often run into. So, a lot of funding does come out only for 1 year. Sometimes that is organized around new work, innovation, but in any case, what seems to happen, even for these rolling contracts with larger organizations where what has been happening for the past 5 years just happens in the 6th year and then happens in the 7th year and so on, still leads to this unfortunate cycle where in the final quarter of the year, uncertainty around the ability to secure funding leads to organizations losing staff. They bleed staff either to public sector organizations who can provide more security or in some cases better terms and conditions. But in any case, moving on to other opportunities. And then when funding is finally guaranteed, sometimes at very late notice, it takes that organization a period of time, perhaps as long as another quarter, to recruit staff and to train them and get back to a normal sort of operating model. So when we are talking about moving away from 1 year funding and moving towards longer term funding opportunities, this is the central problem that we are trying to resolve, that uncertainty leads to significant, I think, inefficiencies in the way the third sector operates and higher costs for the third sector as well in terms of recruiting and retaining staff. We have very briefly, obviously very briefly, I feel like I should have more information on this slide. It seems very short, but very briefly, a good application process for people. What we highlighted is one that says no early to avoid unnecessary work by the third sector, and then gives feedback on unsuccessful applications to help build capacity. And again, what was highlighted through this work was that relationships with Edinburgh partners generally tend to be impersonal. What we find is that for a lot of the organizations we were talking to, they did not know who the Edinburgh partners were. They could not explain what the shared aims of the Edinburgh Partnership was. So when we're thinking about how we try to encourage better collaborative work, those are clear and obvious hurdles that we need to address. But even when there were funding relationships, that relationship often tended to be quite weak. I talk a lot about respect as part of these processes, respect and trust. And I think some of the important things that I would highlight for this is this sort of spectrum. Of what respect actually means, and using specific examples that come from partners. So, obviously, least respectful relationships are things which involve short term changes without engagement, such as we saw through IGB last year, building up to the most respectful. In effect, relationships are ones where you have strategic level engagement, where you have co-production, and where you have really a sense of trust built in with these organizations. The core of this really is about building strong personal relationships and using those personal relationships to better coordinate the work of funder and funded organizations through this. In general, I would say that the third sector's feedback has been um, fair but not good in relation to Edinburgh Partners in for these things. I think there has been a significant erosion of trust that has happened in the last year, but I think every group that I spoke to certainly had good examples that they would talk about, and the council's recent third sector resilience fund certainly seems to have engendered a fair amount of goodwill from the sector as well, where we've clearly stepped in and done something necessary in a timely way, which I think has been welcomed by the sector, but doesn't necessarily erase a generation of practice which was not ideal for this. I have realized as I'm going through this that I am using an older set of slides and not the slides that I had intended to speak to you with. That is just the nature of what I'm going to have to deal with as part of this. I don't think it changes the overall tone of the messages that we've got here. So we think that there are probably some structural problems that we've highlighted where at a national level we see national government ring fencing a lot of funding and making that funding not available for things that the third sector might ideally want to use it on, or which funders, in the case of local councils, for example, might want to deploy it with. Those circumstances can mean that where we would like to address core costs, where we would like to address operating or infrastructure issues for the sector, we are limited by what we can do. So some of the messages that come out of this must be about local government and other Edinburgh partners having a conversation with national funders about having more control locally about where that goes. And certainly, we want to be able to, in some cases, I think, send some of the control around that spending to local areas. So, thinking about how, uh, in some cases, cooperatives of local organizations can function as anchor institutions as part of this, and maybe take some responsibility on for some funds at a lower level. Um, yes, I'd addressed the funding one previously. As I said, these slides are the wrong version. I'm so glad we decided to record this. It's wonderful. I will send out the correct slides, the final set of slides for everyone with these notes. But the final thing that I'd mentioned there was that procurement issue. Interesting feedback we received from the sector. People saying that it is difficult for third sector organizations to interface with public sector organizations' procurement in many cases because they simply don't function in exactly the same way the private sector does, where if you ask for a box, you will get a box, whereas the third sector is about developing bespoke local solutions for people. And in general, the opportunities, as we said before, aren't highlighted particularly well through that. We also identified an issue where organizations in the third sector will sometimes receive peppercorn payments for particular activities. It was highlighted that there was some diversionary activity around fireworks. Last year, many of you will be aware of Edinburgh's issues with fireworks activity around that particular festive period. In that case, what happened was that a number of organisations received payments which were less than the value of the staff time that was being used for diversionary activity in that cases. And I think what we need to see is that where we are having third sector organizations step in outside of contract, outside of things that are covered by grants, for example, that partners are making a real effort to cover all the costs that are involved for those third sector organizations in doing that. We talked a little bit about how funded organizations generally aren't involved in planning. We think that there's probably a big discrepancy in understanding in that third sector organizations probably have um, a lower level of respect, I think, as well, to what the public sector does in many cases, to the inefficiency of public sector organizations. And I think the attitude that is reflected in the public sector is that third sector organizations are sometimes seen as dealing with less significant issues. I don't think that is true. I don't think the third sector thinks that is true as well. But the way we address that essentially is by having better personal connections built up between services. That's everything that I had to cover with you. As I said, we will share that video of the incorrect slides and